All right, hello and welcome to Whisky and Cynicism. This is Island Drams. I'm Simon Smith, and this week I'm thrilled to welcome a good friend of mine, all the way from Sydney, Australia, my friend Ross Blainey of the Balvenie, brand ambassador for Australia and New Zealand. Ross, welcome, and what are you drinking there?
Thanks so much, Simon. Good to see you, man, as well. Good just to catch up in general. It's been a while, but yeah, thanks very much for having me on. I've just poured myself a new little dram. I've thought I'd start off with a Balvenie anyway, but I've just got some of our new Balvenies in. So I've actually got the new Stories release. I don't know if you'll have had this yet, but the 19-year-old, the Edge of Burnhead Wood. So I haven't had a lot of this yet. We only just got it here quite recently. So I think any chance I get at the moment, I'm like, yeah, I'll have another little taste of that. It's not going to be around forever, so I'm like, yeah, cool. Fill my glass with that one.
Nice, man. It's still the morning here, so I'm having a coffee, but I have put a slug of vintage Grand Marnier into it just as a...
Nice. I saw that bottle behind you there. I noticed the Grand Marnier. I haven't mentioned it yet, but yeah, I noticed it there. It's great in a coffee. I mean, it's great in anything, to be honest.
Of course. Our love affair with Grand Marnier will never stop. That's a 1980s bottling, that one, so another victim of my auction craze during lockdown.
Yeah, right. Is the 80s bottling, was it better or is it different?
I'd say it was better. For me, you can tell there was better cognac going into it.
Yeah.
Just a bit like in Scotch, you know, all the blends tend to, you can tell there was better malt and more malt going into it before, you know, there was other markets for it. And I think back then they had access to better cognac to put into a liqueur like that. So you can tell it's a bit richer and a bit fuller.
Yeah, right. Oh, you might need to save me a bit of that for when I can eventually get back over to Scotland again.
2022, we'll do Desert Island Grand Marniers.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yes. We'll do 3 decades of Grand Marnier.
We'll do side by side. I've got a 60s and a friend of mine's got a 70s, so we can do that quite easy.
That's amazing. Yeah, let's do that.
So I guess a bit back. I mean, you and I met. You were working in wine at the time, actually, which is probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And you and I kind of were almost a bit ships in the night, because apart from my couple of years back in Sydney, you left Scotland about the same time I moved here from Australia. And as I say, you worked in bars and the same stuff like I did, and you worked in wine for a bit, then you went back to your first love of whiskey. How do you perceive the kind of difference? And you travel back a lot. I see more now that I live in Scotland than I did when I lived there. How do you perceive the difference in the, I guess, perception, especially of Scotch whiskey, and amongst what is a changing and, from what I've read this week, sometimes controversial Australian whiskey scene?
Yeah, it's been interesting because it was just 10 years, a couple of months ago, since I moved over here on a whim. I literally didn't plan on moving here. I booked my flight over here after 3 pints of Tennent's at lunch, and never looked back. It was in the counting house in Glasgow as well. Great little spot. But since then, it's been interesting because I worked in bars at the beginning, whiskey after that, then brief foray into wine and sales there, and then come back to whiskey. And watching Scotch whiskey and Australian whiskey change over that time has been quite amazing. I mean, to eventually come through working for William Grant & Sons and looking after Balvenie, it's put me in a good spot to really get to know the Australian whiskey industry a lot more. And I try and make a point of every time when I used to be traveling around a lot, every place I would go to, I'd try and take along a little bit of our new make spirit and a couple of cask samples, and try and stop into a distillery and just let them know I was coming and show them our new make spirit and, you know, whatever cask samples I had. And it was great. I got to know so many great people through that, because they were just keen to see, you know, a new make spirit from a distillery in Scotland that's been doing this for 125 odd years, compared to these guys that have been doing it for, some of them maybe 6 months, or some of them maybe a couple of years, some of them maybe 20 years. So I got to know a lot of really great people through that. But the growth in the Australian whiskey industry has been pretty big. I mean, they're all still quite small volumes from all the distilleries. For the most part, there's a few that are now set up for bigger volumes. But I think the main thing I've seen that I really love about the Australian whiskey industry and getting to be a part of it is that I look at the Scotch whiskey industry, and that's what I've loved since I was 18, 19 and starting to get into it. So all the history stuff I've learned about the guys that started it, or the guys that were there at the beginning of some of these distilleries, or the guys that were starting doing blends and started growing whiskey. I'm never going to get to meet those guys. Obviously, they've been dead for a long time. But in Australia, the people that are starting the whiskey industry are here and now, and there are opportunities each year to sit down at a table like Taz Whiskey Week, which I think they just did an online version of this week. You can go there and you can have like the distillers dinner and sit down with Bill Lark and Casey Overeem and their families that are now producing, and plenty of other people. So you can sit down with the people that have created or started the Australian whiskey industry and have grown it. So I just think you don't get to do that many places. Sit down with the founders of a whole country's whiskey industry. I really like that about it.
I suppose Australia just now, it's about 1 second after the Big Bang. It's all still there, and I guess you forget that in Scotland, where everything's so established, you forget that there is such a thing as a youthful whiskey industry, and having its originators still there is quite something. Yeah.
I think it changes so fast here too. Like Scotch whiskey, it's kind of been a slow rise to where it is now, and yeah, like you said, it's like seconds after the Big Bang here. It's happened, and now everyone's going nuts about it, and there's just so much. There's so much like innovation and trying things and different barrels and different barleys and malts, and it's quite amazing to see all of these things. I think maybe the downside, and some of you mentioned like the controversy at the moment around the Australian whiskey industry, is having some kind of structure around what Australian whiskey is. So like having the SWA looking after Scotch, but protecting the name of Scotch. I think a lot of the conversation in Australia now is that we maybe should have that same thing here, to start building the brand of Australian whiskey overall, rather than lots of new individual distilleries all kind of, a lot of them work very closely together too, but having something that pushes the whole country's whiskey, that's part of the controversy at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's always a toss. I mean, it's a constant conversation still in Scotland, even 250 years on. Are we being hamstrung by tradition and regulations, or is it necessary to protect the image of quality? And I think both are true. And I guess finding the balance as Australia moves forward, and also simply being transparent for the consumer. I mean, and that's what the issue can be, is when the consumer is buying what they believe to be A and it's actually B.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's got to be the first part, that people need to know. They need to know what they're buying. I mean, with anything really, and that's because it's repeat customers for any industry. You need people to come back, so they need to know what it is they're getting in the bottle is what they're expecting when they drink it, and that comes down to everything from the quality and the flavour and how it's been made and what distillery is in there. All those things are going to add up to them having the best experience they can. And I always think there was also I remember talking to a few people, they were saying like within Australia there should be almost like a quality control as well as part of that, which I think could be very controversial, because then, well, there's a panel of judges that decide which ones are good enough to be called Australian whiskey, which sounds, I don't know, a bit out there. But if you think about it on a global scale, for Australian whiskey to grow, you need people to have that first whiskey they ever have from Australia to be great, because they might have never, like someone in, somewhere in New York, and they've never had Australian whiskey before. They see it on a menu and think, oh, I didn't even know Australia made whiskey. I'll give that a shot. And if they try it and it's not good, they might never drink Australian whiskey again, or it's like the whole brand of Australian whiskey goes down in their estimations.
So I guess once that trust or that faith in a brand or in a collection of brands, if that trust is broken, either by being missold something or simply having poor quality, it's hard to get it back. We talk a lot. You said you're drinking the Balvenie Stories, the Balvenie Stories 19-year-old there, and you do a lot of work with Balvenie's and the stories range, and talking about there's people's stories. Everyone's got a story. Something that on Whisky and Scissors I've talked about a lot, and I talk about a lot with everyone I know. How important is, Balvenie Stories is a range, and so obviously it can be cynically viewed as simply a marketing ploy, but I think anyone who's drunk whiskey knows that there's obviously more behind it. How important to you are stories, not just in whiskey and behind the liquid, but also interlinking various people's whiskey journeys and bringing whiskey fans, for want of a better word, together.
Yeah, that's I think stories in general. Before talking about like the Balvenie side of it, like stories in general are so important, even outside of whiskey, just in our everyday lives and what we do, whether we're going out to a bar or we're talking to someone at work. We explain things in stories. We talk about things in stories. We convey our emotions and experiences and our knowledge through stories. That's how we pass it on. It's an easier way than, well, it's a more enjoyable way than just saying the hard facts of something. You get it out in a little bit of a story, whether it's 10 seconds or 10 minutes. I think stories are so important in communication and everything. And then in whiskey, I mean, who doesn't like sitting down with a whiskey and hearing a story or telling a story? The more whiskeys you have, the more stories come out. Maybe they're not all completely true stories, but that doesn't really matter. It's about like the experience around it. And I think whiskey is really good for that. But then for us, like for Balvenie, and yeah, like you mentioned there, some people might see it as like this kind of marketing side of things. And I think that's really interesting, because I think when you get to know the story of Balvenie and about the stories range, you see that it's not just a marketing ploy, because you can feel the genuine parts of it. But the way that we got to this was trying to explain why our distillery is a little bit special in some way. The stories range came around through a lot of thinking around how do we want to create connection with people that are drinking the whiskey, and that's important for any distillery. We always want to create connection, and for us, Balvenie's it's all about the craftsmanship behind the whiskey, and for a long time that's been like it's always our main message. It's like what we do. But the handcrafted part, the word handcrafted has kind of become a little bit diluted, I would say, maybe. Like the word handcrafted is used everywhere for everything. I remember seeing the Domino's thick shakes, handcrafted Domino's thick shakes, and you're like, oh, is this what's like? Is handcrafted? Like, is that a good thing here? So the stories part came around. Well, what's the important part of being handcrafted? And for me, it's like the hand. It's the hand that does it. That's why people appreciate the handcrafted nature, because it's a person that's put their life's work into it and their experience and love and passion. And the stories is about bringing to life the people that are behind these stories. I mean, all that knowledge is passed down through generations at Balvenie through stories. So this just brings them to life a little bit more. Like the Edge of Burnhead Wood, the one I'm drinking now, is kind of about the heather trials that we did. So this is actually smoked with heather in the kiln. Very unusual way of making whiskey, almost never done before. And it's about their journey of how they came to do that and why they did it. Finding almost a full piece of heather in a lump of peat and thinking, well, why don't we go and get some heather and try that out in the kiln? And the story kind of unfolds from there. So it's like bringing it to life rather than just having a whiskey that says, oh, here's a whiskey we smoked with heather. It's like you can get people to drink this and think about what they went through to make it. So I think, yeah, stories it brings everything to life a little bit more, I suppose.
I suppose it's that human side to it as well. It's kind of, it wasn't a marketing department dictating down somewhere that a heather whiskey is a good idea. It's, someone's, as we get older in our day-to-day life, it's someone's train of thought from finding an accidental piece of heather to wanting to, then put more in on purpose and see where it gets you to. And I think that human side to it is what the handcrafted and what any brand, big or small, if there's someone at the coalface, as it were, doing it, it's instantly more relatable. Yeah,
I think so. And I think that's, from my perspective, it's been quite successful in that. I know when I'm talking to people about it, they get that. I mean, I suppose my job as a brand ambassador is to make that personal connection, be the person version, the human version of the distillery to help people understand it. And yeah, people appreciate a human connection. I think especially with whiskey, it's all about connection and sharing with people and talking to people. So I think it works quite well.
One of my favorite moments in a distillery was at Lagavulin years ago, and we were at the edge of the the washbacks, and one of the fermenters was just overflowing with suds, and kind of it was just obviously gone a bit hot on the ferment, so we weren't allowed in at that time. But we could still see, and a stillman kind of ran up, chucked what I assume was pretty much just detergent at it to break the surface tension, and I went down again, and then I was like, okay, come away in. So, but I mean, Lagavulin is Diageo. It's huge. They've got 28 malt distilleries. It's the biggest company in the world, and yet you do see a panicked old boy running with a bottle of detergent. It's that straight away thinking, just like all of us, things go right and wrong and up and down, and it's kind of, especially with whiskey, obviously there are huge processing plants in whiskey, but there are most single malt distilleries. There's still someone there keeping an eye on it, and it's quite nice. As I say, that's one of my favorite kind of stories from whiskey, just as a moment. It was a really nice personal connection with what was happening behind a huge marketing machine and a huge kind of behemoth that is Diageo, and even Lagavulin in particular. So I guess for you, I mean, we've all had kind of whiskey moments, and I guess quite a lot of the ones I've had have been with you, because you and I have engaged in some fair idiocy over the years, much of it whiskey driven. What's your kind of favorite moment in whiskey over what must be, I assume, thousands?
Yeah, it is quite a tough question, partly because maybe a lot of them I don't remember. No, there's plenty of good ones. It's hard to choose. I think a lot of looking at the whole whiskey journey that we're talking about before, my whiskey experience is the beginning of sitting in the Fox and Hounds, the pub that I started drinking whiskey in properly, sitting by the fire there, reading the bottle and not knowing anything about whiskey. That's a really fond memory for me. But then more recently, in the job that I do, being able to take, 12 people, like 12 Australian bartenders, some of which have never been to Scotland or out of the country, taking them across to Scotland now, like two opposite ends of maybe whiskey experiences. But I think probably my favourite, or one of the most memorable, one I definitely will never forget, was our trip last year to Islay. I'll never forget that for many great and terrible reasons. I think that was something else.
Yeah, that was the world's two shittest campers trying to pitch a tent in Port Charlotte in the rain.
Yeah, it just because for me anyway at the time, like the position I was in at the time, where I didn't really have anything to do at that point, and I didn't have a holiday planned or anything, so I was just kind of flying with a seat in my pants. And I remember giving you a call, thinking I'd pop over to Edinburgh. I was actually in Berlin at the time, and calling you in Edinburgh and saying, I'm thinking about coming past Edinburgh. Do you want to catch up for a pint at the weekend? And you were just like, oh, mate, I'd love to, but I'm actually going to Islay for the festival this weekend. I was like, oh man, it would have been good to catch up for a pint. Like, but I've organised a two-man tent that I'm borrowing, so if you want to come along, hop in. I was like well, you don't see why not. Why would I not do that? And I think, going from there through a late night in the George Hotel, we threw so many darts that night that I woke up with. I didn't know you could pull muscles from playing darts that much. Either actually it might have been the pints.
Yeah. Well, that was one of those. You talk about whiskey bringing people together. Our tent shat itself after the first night, and the vehicle that we were meant to have went tits up. So without going through a whole weekend's worth of stories between hitchhiking lists from Dave Ferry, who was my boss on the Gold Coast when I moved back, up Canvas Wallace. Dan Waleed now has Highland Whiskey, but was with Lefroy at the time. Bill Lark had a spare room in his cottage down at Port Ellen, and he put us up. TJ, brand ambassador for the Malton Diageo, put us up another night and got us around. Then even just trudging through the rain to get a bus back to the pub to watch the Scottish Cup final because it was pissing me down at Lagavulin Day.
I know. It was just, I think when we ended up in, we had nowhere to stay after the tent was gubbed, and it was Bill Lark, who I knew had an Airbnb, happened to have a spare room that he didn't have before. Somebody had to cancel, and then I just remember the one moment of that whole trip, the memory, was us sitting in that living room, just nice little Scottish cottage in Islay. We're sitting with Bill Lark, Dan Woolley popped in, Tim Duckett as well, and his family from Tassie, Mark Nicholson, and we're sitting with cups of tea and some of the best, kind of rarest drams off of Islay distilleries, and we've got biscuits on the table. I remember just sitting there thinking, this is mental. Like, I can't believe this is happening right now. Last week I didn't know where I was going. This week I'm sitting with some of the, the best people I know and some of the legends of Australian whiskey. that was a cool memory. I won't forget that feeling of sitting in that room.
Shortly after which, Bill Lark cooked us a prawn curry from memory.
I think it was a seafood risotto. That was it.
So it was. I mean, even
I said I'd pick up a pizza on the way, and he said, "No, we'll cook you dinner." And then they cooked this whole big thing of, yeah.
And there was also the guys from, I can't remember the name of the distillery. You might be able to remind me. I know they go by the Whisky on Instagram, but they were sailing around on a toll ship. We did a Lagavulin tasting for their birthday on the ship with Colin Dunn, one of the legends of the Scottish whisky industry. So, I mean, if you want to talk about, you know, over a lifetime, whiskey trails bringing you together, I mean, Isla in general kind of has that, but that particular weekend for us, it was, I mean, the amount of connections were made in 3 days is quite phenomenal. You know, it really did exemplify that whole stories thing, and you know, what a time, but what, you know, us having that time relying on about 30 other people, because we couldn't rely on ourselves.
Well, there's so many great little things about the whiskey industry that I think that story kind of showed, and that experience showed us, like, everyone helps each other out. It's a very close kind of family, no matter which side of the world you're on, and everyone's just so friendly. It's like one big kind of whiskey family. Sounds really cheesy, but it was like that. It
is what it is. I mean, there's a travel blog of me going to Isla about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even more, on the website. Maybe you and I should kind of do a Zoom call over a few pints one night and try and put down in writing, in case anyone's wondering kind of the extent of what we went through that weekend.
We should definitely do that. That would be great.
Let's put it down and we'll exchange ideas. Well, with the time difference, I'll have a few pints and write a bit my night time, and then you can kind of wait 12 hours and do it. And just over time, we'll piece it back together.
That's a great idea. I love that.
So we'll change tact a little bit here. It can't all be positivity. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. So, I mean, in the whiskey industry, in the drinks industry, and you might have a bit of a slightly different view on this than a lot of the other people I've spoken to, because you're the first who works deeply in the Australian industry that we've had, and obviously every culture and the way it appreciates drinks and whiskey is hugely different, and therefore there will be the good and the bad will be different. So what annoys you most about the drinks industry or the whiskey industry in general?
I'm trying to pick just one. No, there's you know, I think on the whole things are, we work in a fun industry. You know, it is good fun. I think the thing that gets me within drinks, within whiskey especially, is like the elitism thing, which I think whiskey drinkers get, not so much like the distilleries, but I think whiskey drinkers get this, and it's like there's a certain point where you start drinking whiskey and you don't know enough a lot about it, and you're enjoying your journey and you're enjoying taking in as much information as you can and, you know, learn from people. And then there's a little bit where I think some people, like, they've learned a little bit, so they've got their opinions, which is great. Everyone should have opinions on whiskey and their favorites and things. But then when those opinions become like so strong that I think it kind of starts to detract from the enjoyment of whiskey. So like I think that goes away again. You keep learning, and it's a little bit in the middle where you have this elitism. You learn a bit more, and that starts to go away, and you're more accepting. But like cask strength, you know, that one usually gets me, because sometimes people will ask, you know, why does Balvenie not have any cask strength whiskey? And you know, the answer is often that, well, cask strength doesn't necessarily mean that it tastes better. You know, we have, I mean, David Stewart, our malt master, his name is on the label, and he wants to put it out where he sees the best aromas and flavour and what showcases the distillery character and what he wants. That's not necessarily what it looks like exactly out of the barrel. So bringing it down a bit can change that. But then for some people, it's like, no, cask strength and nothing else. I don't drink anything that's not cask strength. And that kind of, it just niggles me. And I just want to, I don't know, I want to talk to people like that. I want to be like, well, you know, why? Like, there's so many other flavors and different things that come out of adding water to whiskey. You know, that's probably the thing that gets me the most, I think. It's quite a small thing.
Even at cask strength, it's still 40% whiskey, 40% water. You know, I mean, I think that's what annoys me is the idea of more ABV is just simply better. And I found myself, because I only drink whiskey when I tend to be in whiskey bars as such, whether it be, you know, at the Balmoral in Edinburgh or something like Nauticus or whatever, and you tend to go for stuff that you haven't had before, or weird releases, which do tend to be upper cask strength or high strength. and same with my work. You know, the samples we get tend to be the same. And so I realized, I know, and this isn't because you're here, but I had a dram of the Doublewood maybe a month or so ago, because it was just on the shelf and I haven't had it for a while. And at 40%, my first mouthful was like, fuck, that tasted almost nothing, because my palate was so used to, just not because I seek it out, but just because that's the type of whiskey you tend to drink if you don't sit at home with a bottle of a blend regularly, which wasn't pre-lockdown. Now I am doing that a lot more regularly. But then once you get past that and you take that out of the equation, you know, the depth of flavor you get in a 40% whiskey is so much more nuanced, and it's a much longer situation. You're not trying to pick apart a huge beast of a dram. It's all just kind of there and very enjoyable. And sometimes you just want to pour 2 fingers of it into a tumbler and sit at the telly and just kind of sip away at it. And I think it's so much easier to do that with an ABV of 46 or less than it is a cask strength, because you're not chewing on or thinking about every sip.
Yeah, that's it. And I think, you know, all the different whiskies have their place. And, you know, even like coming back to the Australian whiskey industry, which another change that we're seeing a lot of now is from, you know, I suppose a lot of the Australian style before. Australia's still finding its style, but it was a lot of very young, very high strength, very oak influenced whiskey, which can be very good, and it also that has its place too, and people enjoy that. It's like it's a punch in the face. It's like, it's big and it's bold and it's got a lot to it, and I love it. But then also, like, through the experience of the distilleries here, using bigger barrels and less oak influence and bringing the strength down to have a different whiskey, you know, something different that is maybe, I hesitate saying more palatable, but I suppose it is a bit easier on the palate, that you can enjoy it in a different way. So that it's like when you've got these things, you know, it doesn't have to be cask strength. And if you only drink cask strength, you're just missing out on a lot of other whiskey that's incredibly good. Yeah.
I find a huge thunder and lightning storm quite exhilarating, but I don't want to be in one at all times. You know, I mean, kind of, you can
That's a great analogy for it.
Yeah. So I mean, I only drink cask strength. Well, you're just missing out on a lot of good whiskey then. So, yeah, that's your own fault. And
yeah, that's it.
Speaking of good whiskey, we should get to them, because I'm quite aware that I think this has been the longest of these I've ever done, but it was always going to be with you and I naturally anyway.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, the 3 people that watch this have already fallen asleep. But we must get to the point of it all, and I'm sure you've had plenty of time to think about it. What would be the 3 drams you take to your desert island?
Yeah, it's a good question. Glad you asked. I've had plenty of time to think about it. You'd think of an answer straight away. Okay, so it's difficult doing this, as I'm sure everyone would say. It's hard to choose the 3. The first one is an easy one, and I'm not choosing any Balvenie ones in here because I work for Balvenie. I feel lucky that I work for Balvenie because I love it, not the other way around. First one would be the 12 Doublewood. That's my first one. There we go. That would be my first one. I'm always happy drinking that. I say that's been one of my top 3 whiskies, like, since I was 19. If someone asks my favorite whiskey, I'll never say that's always my favorite, because it changes, but it's always been one of my top 3 since I was 19. So Doublewood, I could drink it all day, every day, desert island or sit in my house. Always happy with it. The second 2, it gets more difficult. So I was kind of trying not to be too on brand and just choose Balvenie. But as I thought about it more, the second one I would choose would be another Balvenie. And I say this completely honestly, not because I'm trying to promote another whiskey, because the other one I would choose is one that you can't get anymore. I happen to have one here. This is how I ended up choosing it. So it's I don't know if you can see that, the 17-year-old rum cask. So that was a limited edition one we did years ago. And for something a little bit more decadent, something a little bit more out there, it's finished in Jamaican, very like old aged rum, Jamaican rum barrels. And it's one of my favorite whiskies I've ever had. So if I could have one for Desert Island, that would be it. And the third one, I have to go for something smoky. I love Isla whiskey. There's some good memories there, as we've talked about. And then it was tossing up between something from Bruichladdich and Lagavulin. And I think I'd probably have to go with the Lagavulin 16. It's a heart between going with something kind of really out there and big and bold from Islay, or one that is just an absolute favourite. Well, Lagavulin 16, another one that I'm just always happy to drink that. It's always good, it's balanced, it's got the smokiness and the sweetness. And yeah, I think having the double wood, the 17 rum cask, and the Lagavulin 16, if I only had those three, I think I'd be pretty good. I'd be all right.
That sounds pretty good to me. I have to say, I mean, I think you're the 9th person now to do this. So I mean, if all of us got together on that island, I mean, that's a serious backfire that we've got happening right now. And I mean, if anyone's thinking that Ross has just picked Balvenies to try and sell Balvenie, if people are trying to sell products, this is not the format by which they do it. This is not advertising space that anyone actually wants. So I do believe him when he says it. And
yeah, if all four of you can go and buy a bottle, that'd be great.
Yeah, my mum's got 3 bottles of Balvenie now, so.
Oh, that's great.
And in something of a continuity nightmare, the Grand Marnier has been replaced by the Balvenie Doublewood, and I think this is the first time I've actually been able to cheers someone with one of their Desert Island Drams. So Ross, firstly, thank you so much for joining us, man. It's been great to catch up after what feels like quite a few months. And unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of time before we can have another stupid adventure based on whiskey, man. But hopefully we can do it again whenever world comes back to normal. So, Slange about, mate.
No, Simon, thank you so much. It's been great chatting to you. It's been good just going through all that. Maybe the longest one yet, but it's been great fun chatting to you. So thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I look forward to chatting soon. Yeah, cheers to you, man.